So excellent. Very excited today. Our company, Corner Alliance, we do a lot of work with the federal government on issues ranging from broadband, 5G to cyber. And obviously cyber has become a huge issue over the last even couple of decades, and brought home to all of us earlier last year with the SolarWinds hack. So we put together a very distinguished panel today. I'm very excited to hear from them. We have Parham Eftekhari. He is the Senior Vice President and Executive Director for the Cybersecurity Collaborative, a cyber risk alliance community. He's also the founder and chairman of the Institute for Critical Infrastructure Technology, ICIT, the nation's leading cybersecurity think tank. And he has over 15 years of experience partnering with technology and national security leaders on these issues. And then we have Lauren Zabierek, who is currently serves as the executive director of the Cyber Project at Harvard's Kennedy School, where my wife is a graduate of, and in their Belfair Center. And then finally, we have Max Romanik, who works with us here at Corner Alliance running our cyber portfolio. He's been involved in cyber issues for a long time, ever since getting his legal degree, and has been with Corner Alliance for the last several years, working across DHS, S&T, CISA, other clients as well. So that is our very illustrious panel. And what I wanted to start out with is something, is really talking about our workforce. So one of the things that many of our federal clients are constantly questioned about is how do they recruit a qualified cyber workforce? Today, I saw even in the Wall Street Journal did a big report on artificial intelligence. There's a massive gap in talent in that field, and cyber is right alongside it. So we pulled some statistics from the International Information System Security Certification Consortium. And they're saying the cyber workforce needs to grow by at least 145% to meet the global demand. And that shortfall really accounts for almost 4 million people. So that's quite a few people we got to get trained and up to speed. So Parham, I want to turn to you first. What do you see as the major challenges that government in particular faces, and U.S. government even more particular, faces when competing against the private sector for those cybersecurity experts?
Yeah, Reed, Alan, thanks for having me. I think one of the first things that comes to mind here, obviously, is just the competitive nature of the job landscape. You mentioned some statistics there. There's a lot of competition for limited resources, and the reality is that private sector organizations oftentimes have deeper pockets and have more flexibility with respect to the offers they can make, whether it's immediate financial compensation, other job perks. For some startups or established companies, it could be incentive packages with stock options or equity plays. And so I think one of the most the biggest challenges government faces is just straight compensation, both coming out of the gate or from a poaching perspective. Right, we see a lot where individuals join the public sector, and there's nothing wrong with this approach. But you work in the government for a couple of years, they start to accomplish great things for our nation, and then they get noticed by some of our private sector partners, and they get poached, and it's a pretty common occurrence. And so I think that's one of the biggest things out there. I think the hiring process is also very cumbersome. I know a lot of folks who want to get into the government space, and it takes upwards of a year. I can't tell, and this is up and down your career path, whether you're trying to get into the government as one of my family members is right now, who's just out of college, or whether I know folks who are looking at SES level positions, and it's all the same conversation. It just takes months and months and months, and most people can't afford to wait that long. And so there's a lot of just complexities there. And I'll talk a little bit later about how even some of the programs government's doing right now are facing some internal bureaucratic processes. And I think the last thing before I turn it over to you is there's just a brand problem. I think right now, unfortunately, all of us on this call have government backgrounds from different perspectives. We all love the government. We know that behind the sensationalization of what happens in government, there's just a lot of, hundreds of thousands of good people who care about the country, care about the mission of their agency or organization, trying to do good work. That gets lost in the noise. And I think that the government just has to do a better job at promoting and socializing the opportunities that exist and why it is good for the nation and good for your career to enter a role. And that requires marketing and HR and communications that aren't really funded a lot of times in appropriations budgets. And so I think all of these things create a perfect storm to exacerbate some of the challenges you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, some of this plumbing issues that maybe aren't the most dramatic and fun things to work on can be some of the biggest barriers, right? And I was really interested to see Secretary Mayorkas with his 60-day sprints that he announced is talking about a partnership with the Girl Scouts, actually to start potentially, on a cyber education platform. So going to organizations that promote public service and marketing, DHS and the cyber career field sounds like an interesting plan. I plan to get my daughters into that. So, Lauren, any perspective from you on that recruiting challenge and retention challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on today to talk about this. So there's kind of three things that, actually four things that I think about when it comes to the recruiting and the retention issue. So first, it's the issue of getting people in, and as Parham was mentioning, there's a lot of challenges with that. One thing that we're actually going to be talking about in a forthcoming paper that we're hoping to release very soon is utilizing the concept of a service year. And President Biden just signed into a law, something that gives $1 billion for a service year for national service. And we think that cybersecurity is ripe for a service year. A lot of people that I hear from, who are trying to break into cybersecurity, training and certifications are cost prohibitive. And then even if they get those, then they're having a hard time, getting into jobs that, require a certain amount of experience. So what if, you give, say, a year of service, and in return, you get your training and maybe some certification costs paid for, and you get a year of experience? I think it's a win-win for everybody.
Cyber for America.
Exactly. Yeah. And there are, there's like Service Year Alliance, for instance, who's working to get this, not cyber specifically, but the, service year going. There's also, for college students, for instance, thinking about internships. And I know there's internships out there, but we should really be focusing on paying people, because I know some students who who are really interested in taking an internship, but they can't because it's not paid for. And that's an issue for a lot of people, not just, there's certain people who are like, oh, that's okay if it's not, a paid internship, I can deal with it. Many people can't, and they need to be paid. Yeah. There was also a new law that was just passed. It's called the Department of Homeland Security, Intelligence, and Cybersecurity Diversity Fellowship Program Act. And that one was actually developed by my partner on a program called Share the Mic in Cyber. Her name's Hope Goins. And this bill requires DHS to carry out intelligence and cybersecurity diversity fellowship program. So getting out to, the historically Black colleges and universities and other areas to help, bring in a more diverse cadre of people. And then, finally, it's not all about recruitment, it's also about retention. And so focusing on the middle, and this is something that Share the Mic in Cyber does, but really shines a light on the people who are already in the space, their accomplishments, and then helping to create pathways to promotion and leadership. That really helps with retention. So those are my main thoughts on that piece.
Yeah, I'd be interested, just from your perspective, you are a former federal employee, correct? And so what attracted you to serving
I'll be honest. I got a scholarship through Air Force ROTC way back. You know, to the University of New Hampshire. You know, and then I was very fortunate to, you know, I had my school paid for through that scholarship. And then I had 4 years, actually almost 5 years of military officer experience. So that not only paid for my school, but I got 5 years of leadership experience and my clearance, you know, all, you know, adjudicated and created. So, but you know, I certainly never had, you know, the goal to join the military when I was younger. Even though my father was in the military, I still wasn't, you know, like, oh, I could join the military. This is something that I could do. It really took, you know, something to basically my parents suggesting that I look into ROTC to pay for college. And so, you know, getting those sort of opportunities and, you know, really showing especially young women that they have this option, I think is important. And that's actually something that my friend Lauren Guita, who is the founder and CEO of Girl Security, is doing. So you mentioned, you know, with the Girl Scouts and, you know, trying to get, you know, visibility there, but, you know, she has an organization called Girl Security, which is really working hard to get girls and young women, you know, in middle school, high school, and even college interested in these national security areas.
That's fascinating. So lots of pathway ideas there.
Yeah.
And I went to University of Vermont, so we'll be
Oh.
editing out that UNH reference later. So.
Exactly.
Max, so Max, turning to you. So you work with these clients day to day, the workforce we're talking about. What are sort of the pressures and retention ideas and things that arise based on your observations?
Sure. So, you know, you see a lot of times that they definitely have difficulty with the recruitment side. Don't have any sort of counterpoints to anything that my colleagues here have been explaining. That definitely are trends that I see extensively. Where I think some innovation from government hiring practices could happen is to try and focus on areas where they actually have some competitive advantage over private sector. One of the big ones is providing a sense of mission. Private sector does not have the ability to do that in the same meaningful way. I mean, you can have an internal company mission, but rarely can you serve your entire community the way you can with government service. And I just don't see recruiting practices trying to focus in on areas like that where working for the government is in fact unique. And if you start from that perspective, then they have the ability to align not just your personal mission, but mission of the agency itself. That's very transformative for breaking down legacy silos and driving at innovation and collaboration amongst those different partners. It puts people walking in lockstep in a way that frequently is difficult to do in government service. You know, you don't have that sort of like unifying motive, like a profit motive that you have in private industry. So figuring out how to get people to work towards the same goals sometimes can be fairly challenging. And obviously some of those retention issues remain for the federal government just the same as private industry. I mean, one of the trends you see is that you have really talented engineers whose only career path is to find their way up into management. And a lot of engineers don't want to lead and manage people, but they also don't want their careers to stall out midway through. And so trying to find some you know, innovative career models that would eliminate some of those trends can be really transformative as well. Government has the ability for those people to sometimes serve as like a SME role, where they get to float between teams and provide their expertise without having to lead teams of individuals. And then that gives them something to do where they don't stop at a GS-12 and can go no higher. You know, that provides some advancement. Private industry could adopt a model like that. And I think it would help generally to retain and recruit the right sort of people for these roles.
And so you mentioned a little bit about engineering and other skill sets. So what do you see as the core skill sets that the government needs, given the emerging complex cybersecurity environment we have?
So I look at it less as like what discipline are they expert in, and more like the sort of personal characteristics that those types of folks have. So you could be an engineer, you could be a policy expert. Any of those are fine, but some personal characteristics that I find particularly transformative. It really helps if you have people that have sort of an immunity to marketing. These are really complicated topics that are easy to craft narratives around, that sort of present half-truths and oversimplifications of very complicated topics. Someone who is always going to look at that sort of stuff and go, I'm not sure that tells the whole story, or there's missing information here. That sort of person can be very successful. Systems thinkers, people that view the world as having all these interconnected parts, and that they have lots of experience with like systems where they can then draw parallels between. So they're facing some sort of challenge in their day-to-day. Oh, I've seen something like this, but it was back when I was doing, related work on infrastructure, but now this same trend is presenting itself on a network security problem. People that can cross that bridge can frequently be very, very clever and creative. And then having to have a high capacity for linear logic, especially in cybersecurity. One thing has to come before the next. If you skip steps, you're going to have big problems down the line. And recognizing when you're making logic leaps is a very difficult challenge. And then for CISA specifically, they have this mission of the nation's risk advisor. That means you have to think at scale. And that's definitely a tricky skill that frequently has to be learned. A lot of people, that's not an innate sort of intuitive way to conceive of the world. And so if you take that package of characteristics, then you put them in an engineer, you put them in a policy expert, they're going to have a really good chance of having a level of success that's uncommon.
Interesting. Parham, any perspective from you on the skill sets necessary?
No, Max, I think those are spot on. I think some of the other ones, this may not be, this may depend on, coming in at a different level, but I think one of the things overall that's really important is the culture of the organization. And this is, Lauren was talking about retention. I think, this is when it comes down to leadership qualities and soft skill qualities, how to communicate, how to create cultures that, particularly, I think anybody, but I think particularly as you get into the younger generations, there is almost a requirement now that the work-life balance exists, that work be enjoyable, that and I think those are just fundamental different philosophies than maybe existed a few decades ago. And I think that it's really important that particularly the new leadership that comes into these roles understands that, knows how to motivate, knows how to, I'm sure we'll talk about diversity and inclusion, at some point in this conversation. It's something that everyone loves to talk about. It's an important thing to talk about. But how do you actually implement that, right? How do you write job descriptions differently to remove unconscious biases? How do you implement testing technologies so it doesn't really matter what the person's pedigree is in terms of where they went to school or how much training they had, but if they can take some sort of a test and get the job done, well, they're a good fit for that job. It really doesn't require, it shouldn't matter if they have a certification or not. Like those types of things, which is how we can fundamentally start to tackle inequality and inequity and diversity and close some of these gaps. And so I think these are all, forward-thinking leaders who are thinking broadly, kind of at scale that Max mentioned. I think is another really important characteristic we should be looking for, particularly for folks who are coming in at the GS15 SES level in some of these roles.
Yeah. I assume getting locked into a skiff 14 hours a day responding to the SolarWinds hack makes it difficult to have the work-life balance, but there's definitely ways to think through that. And the other thing I've always seen as a challenge in these sort of roles, whether it be cybersecurity or another core federal function, is a lot of people from the outside might think, hey, you come in, you tell somebody to do something and they go do it, right? But what we're dealing with is an agency that might be the lead or the quarterback, as Secretary Mayorkas said, does not necessarily have authority over all the other agencies it works with, much less the state and local agencies, much less private industry, right? So it can be a very complex management challenge to get all those people to work together.
Yeah, and I'm gonna Lauren mentioned one of the programs on the apprenticeship side. There's another one that I just learned about. It's called the Cyber Talent Initiative, and it's a similar concept where it's the short of it is you work for the government for a couple of years. You get reimbursed by the sponsor companies. I think it's MasterCard and Microsoft and a couple others, and they'll reimburse your studies, your undergraduate or graduate degree up to I think $75,000 or $80,000. And then I don't believe you're guaranteed a job afterwards, but I think there is a hope that after you work for a public sector agency that you will have done a good job, and that's a pathway to a career. So I think Lauren was spot on in that comment of apprenticeships, and and internships. I think those are really important to solve some of these problems that we're talking about.
Yeah, definitely. I think we've seen that model work before. So sounds like the next bill from Lawrence, or paper, right? One of you guys. So excellent. So then moving sort of back, I was talking a little bit about the coordination challenges. So that's something the new administration is facing coming in. And I know, Lauren, your team at the Kennedy School has advocated for the new National Cyber Director role, which I believe was codified in the National Defense Authorization Act that just passed at the end of the year here, and created this new National Cyber Director, who's going to be Senate confirmed advisor to the president. Why do you think this position is so important, and why did you advocate for it?
Yeah, so, we held a panel earlier in the year that explored what the National Cyber Director would and, could do, whether it's, budget and authorities and things like that. And I understand, as you said, the Biden administration is conducting a thorough review of the role. And so, should they decide to fill it, I think that the person in that role could have an opportunity to really set the strategy for fundamental change in, especially in the public and private partnership when it comes to cybersecurity. I see that person as the bridge and, as the one who sets that strategy for, this absolutely vital engagement. And I want to see this role with, authority and budget, as I mentioned, to, also help to unravel the interagency, as you mentioned, with an agency that is as, tasked with, advisory in the private sector, but, more of an operational mandate in the federal government. There's obviously, you have all kinds of different agencies, working together, or, maybe at times just, their equities may be at odds, for instance. And these are actually more points that we're going to be addressing in our upcoming report. So, it's not that we've necessarily advocated for, the role itself. I think, even if the president decides to, say, however he decides to fill it or to deal with it, I just think the role itself, could be a very important role in, again, trying to unravel the interagency, trying to sort of, wrangle all of players and get them to align, if you will, and then, work, with the private sector rather. So yeah, I'm really interested to see what they actually do, who they fill it with, and how that person actually starts to fill the office and set those priorities out.
I think there are lots of super qualified people on the panel here. So, Lauren, so when's that report coming out?
Good question. We're hoping, honestly, I would say mid-May. So we've been working on this report for over a year now, and interviewing myriad stakeholders in the public sector and the private sector, and really trying to map out the current state and also set a vision for collaborative defense and enhanced threat intelligence analysis and sharing. So we have 5 strategic objectives, and yeah, so we're getting very close to finishing and getting it out the door.
Excellent. So what other kinds of short things do you think the administration should be prioritizing, and particularly in early days?
With the NCD, you mean?
Just in general, like on the cyber issue. So we talked a little bit about the policy position, but then obviously you're working on this report. So what other things are you seeing that the administration needs to get on top of?
Well, one thing that is top of mind right now is supply chain security. And so President Biden just signed the executive order 14017, I believe, that mandates, a review of supply chain vulnerabilities, and then also mandates recommendations moving forward. So that's important. I'm also working with this organization or this initiative called the Secure and Competitive Markets Initiative that Tatiana Bolton at R Street Initiative has, or R Street Institute, sorry, has started. And we're looking at a bunch of different issues within that whole topic as well. So, I think that's going to be, it is a huge priority, especially because he signed that executive order so early in his administration to really, start that process. And I'm very, very hopeful that that review will reveal, the things that we truly need to work on, and also reveal where we can actually make some change, whether that's through, legislative actions to compel or incentivize organizations, companies, et cetera. And then of course, how do we work with our allies, our Five Eye partners, to actually improve things. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Right. And then Max, turning to you. So Lauren talked a little bit about the interagency coordination. Can you kind of give us a sense of, for those who don't know, how the federal government is organized around cyber issues right now?
Sure.
Just at a high level.
Yeah. At the very highest level, you have agencies that sort of have offensive responsibilities, and then agencies that have defensive responsibilities. So DoD is obviously your primary sort of offensive cybersecurity capability that the government has. Sometimes that is executed through the NSA, sometimes it's DoD proper. They also have some defensive capability, but really most of the defensive capabilities are housed with CISA. And they're the ones that are responsible for providing defensive cyber capabilities across the rest of the civilian side government. Some of that is a little bit tricky. Most of CISA's playbook frequently comes from DoD legacy programs that they've now made available to civilian agencies. It's a struggle to find fit. A lot of the requirements that the DoD built those programs around don't exist in the civilian space, thank goodness. And so when they're trying to retrofit those products to those arenas, you end up with some difficult implementation hurdles. And so it does leave certain functions sort of lacking when you think of the world in purely offensive and defensive terms. Response and recovery don't really get their fair shake in that. And so if you have any sort of flaw in the defensive posture, then everybody's left sort of scrambling. And I think we just saw how that plays out with the recent SolarWinds type of hack. And so, but between that, then at the other next level down, you have a small army of contractors and consultants that help make all of the infrastructure move. And with the level of autonomy that the agencies have and these patchwork of contractors, you have a very, very complicated threat fabric that you have to deal with. And so anytime you can sort of find ways to eliminate some of those threats, that's helpful. But that's sort of at the high level what we're dealing with, at least on the federal government side.
How do you think we can go about improving that coordination,
Well, certainly,
how complex it is?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that comes up with that quickly is that there's been a big focus on shared cybersecurity services of late, where you would have a centralized service provider housed at like CISA, and other partner agencies would be able to access those services through a central portal. Very convenient for eliminating vulnerability points and taking out some of the endpoints in a whatever your network infrastructure looks like. But if you're going to move that direction, especially with the problems we've had with legacy DoD programs, it seems like it would be helpful to then do shared requirements gathering. And that's definitely a skill that is not really well represented government side so far, at least in this context. There's not a lot of ability to try and gather up what those requirements would look like, so that if you're then customizing a DoD program or finding a new service, making sure that it's tailored to meet those needs, I think would help a lot. And then you could actually start to explore ideas like maybe a response or recovery function within some of the civilian side agencies in particular could help eliminate some of the fallout that happens when you have something as cataclysmic as a SolarWinds type of hack.
Interesting. So sort of almost like a FEMA type model there.
That would certainly be one way to do it. And if you really want to get down to brass tacks, you could tie funding to requiring collaborative sort of models for it. And, you know, if the money's going to force them into that sort of posture, then you're probably going to see some results. But obviously that's using the big stick.
Dangerous words, dangerous words.
Yes,
all right.
indeed.
Parham, so turning to you. So we talked a little bit about intergovernmental coordination. So you do a lot of work, you know, with the private sector as well. So how do we plug the private sector, which is so crucial, obviously, into this conversation?
Yeah, that's and those are great examples. When you look at legislation, you obviously don't ever want to over-regulate, but I think legislation is a critical piece of this. Policy is extremely important to solving these issues. I think Max hit on it. You know, I was recently in a closed door, you know, a boardroom session that we do for the Cybersecurity Collaborative, and we had a leading privacy expert, and we were talking about privacy. And it was interesting just to take a step back. And so it was with a bunch of, you know, about a dozen or 15, maybe Fortune 500 CISOs. And, you know, hearing the impact of the fragmented nature of our country's privacy laws, right? We don't have a national privacy guidance. So these companies, forget about all the international privacy laws they have to comply with. They now have the California privacy law. Well, that didn't really create the monumental shift everyone thought it would, but now you have, I believe it's the state of Washington and Virginia, West Virginia, and Ohio. There's a couple other states that are now crafting their own privacy laws. And in the next 3 or 4 years, what's going to be expected, you know, per this conversation, is that there's now going to be maybe 7, 8, 9, up to 10 states that each have their own privacy laws. And as soon as you start seeing this increasingly complex network and fabric of compliance regulations out there, I think you're going to see a request from the private sector for the government to step in and say, hey, we can't manage all this. And going back to the workforce issue, because it's taking a significant amount of resources, and we don't have a lot of resources. We got to put our limited resources in value added areas. So if the government can step in and create a national privacy framework that can apply and kind of you know, supersede all these state policies and create a baseline, then we have something to work on. I think these are the areas where the government can really be impactful, not to legislate, but to responsibly legislate and mandate cybersecurity to create efficiencies. And this is where it's so, you know, the work that, you know, Lauren does and all of her colleagues and you know, everyone in this community who has an opportunity to work with the public sector, ensuring that the dialogue that's had on Capitol Hill is not led by the special interest of, you know, lobbyists, right, who are there to ensure that it's their organizations or, you know, and their constituents that are just going to benefit from how the law is written, but it's national security, it's the citizen data, it's all those types of things. So I think you know, having private sector, we tell them all the time, you're the leader of a major organization, even mid-sized organizations, call up your elected officials, say this stuff matters to you, and educate them on how this is impacting your organization, how it's impacting your ability to generate commerce and create wealth and create jobs. Like, help connect the dots, because you don't often understand how these things are all cyclical. So I think that's a very long-winded answer of saying I do believe there's a really important role for legislation in this space if it's done responsibly and if you get the right folks involved. And I think that's where the private sector needs to just have more opportunities to engage and, at a minimum, educate how the policy could impact them if done in, you know, one way versus the other.
Yeah, definitely. So this sounds, you know, one thing I've been reading about recently is just the fear that something like GDPR in Europe has now essentially enshrined the largest corporations as really the only people who can respond to all the requirements of GDPR. So I'd assume in the regulatory, in the legislative process, that's going to be a big concern to make sure we're not just enshrining a few large companies that comply with the government's mandates for cyber or privacy, but still allow, you know, it's going to be this tension with innovation and smaller companies, I assume.
Yeah, and I'm by no means a privacy expert, but I, you know, when I think about how any other sector has navigated federal legislation and federal policies, this is where American and these days global ingenuity and innovation comes into play. We absolutely, I believe, have through automation capabilities and technologies, have the opportunity to take what's been codified into law and automate certain processes, leverage information sharing and collaboration. So every organization doesn't have to do it on its own. We always talk about it, the collaborative, democratizing access to information. There's big organizations figured it out. Let's extract that information, put it in some sort of frameworks and give access to it to the mid and small size organizations, so everyone can have access to this. And that let's reinforce that with automation tools and capabilities, so we don't have these things become barriers of entry. But on the flip side, depending on the technology or the application that we're talking about, maybe there are some cases where we say, look, there is a minimum requirement to play in the space. If you're talking about developing technologies that go into missile defense systems, right? And we're talking about developing code for that, there absolutely should be a minimum standard of supply chain, from a security perspective, DevSecOps. And if you can't meet that, maybe there isn't anything wrong with saying, unfortunately, you aren't at the level to be able to participate in this. And so I think we have to look at it from these multiple layers of national security, economic resiliency, and obviously fairness and creating opportunities for everybody. So it's not an easy solution, but I absolutely think it can be done.
Could be barriers to me getting my exploding kittens app. I don't know. But you're saying this is probably something in the next 5 years, is that? Did I hear you right? Or
on the call, we were the guidance that was given was that if in the next 3 to 4, in the next couple of years, we see 5, 6 states pass their own laws, you will now see pressure on the federal government to step in and say, this is now too much for us to handle. Federal government needs to step in and do something about it. So we'll see, check back in a couple of years to see if that prediction is true.
That's going to be a big one. So Lauren, are you guys doing any work in this area on the regulatory side or thoughts about that?
This is something that we are, not right now, I'll just say that. I think we'd like to tackle it over the next year, but kind of more to come on that. But to Parham's point, I think it's super important. And if you have 50 different laws, that companies have to contend with, that's going to be just a non-starter, I think. And so I think it's important to do it, not only from that perspective, a business perspective, but of course, a security perspective, to protect everyone, protect citizens, protect companies, protect, government, basically. So I think it's a good idea overall. And yeah, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to adjust something there.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, and I think we're kind of seeing this, this issue play out just in the overall broadband 5G or future 5G space as well, right? Yeah. So I think 5G is probably the last international standard. Who knows, but doesn't feel like in the room and work out at the Mobile World Congress and come up with 6G. I don't know, but that seems unlikely at this point. So do you think we're seeing the same thing going to happen with cyber, where there's just this division internationally? And so I would assume many of these Fortune 500 companies are kind of stuck where they have operations and business and all this stuff in foreign countries that might be considered adversaries, right, on the cyber front.
Yeah,
seems like a mess coming up.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's something that I've been thinking about too. Last year we published a paper advocating for increased transatlantic collaboration on AI. And, of course, we think this should be, happening writ large too. So for all emerging technologies. And I think now with the Biden administration, they're very focused on this. And I think there's a lot of work that we need to do, to repair relationships and, really start to put some, dialogue in place, not only on the R&D side, but, the development or the application side as well. And we crafted this argument from a norms and values standpoint. We should be collaborating with our transatlantic partners, our allies, our Five Eye partners because we share the same democratic values, right? And so we need to work together in order to counter foreign authoritarian adversaries. But, I was recently in a conversation with someone who, at the very lowest level, with businesses, when they're confronted with different products and, say one is cheaper, or maybe that's the only one, that they have available, that's a problem. So we can talk about norms and values, I think, all day, and it's a very important thing. But, at the brass tacks, I hate to use the cliche, but, where the rubber meets the road, we need to also be providing alternative and better quality products for people to actually, and businesses to actually use.
And then, so in the 5G space, there's the Open RAN initiative that the administration is providing some funding for, and things of that nature. But that's going to probably have to be an ongoing investment across, and Five Eyes being Canada, US, England, Australia, New Zealand,
Mm-hmm.
who have an intelligence collaborative. Any other perspective on that, with the Fortune 500 being stuck in between, maybe potential adversaries on the cyber front, Parham, or is that?
I was going to add on to what Lauren's spot on, and I think with regards to giving good alternatives, I think what goes with that is corporations, companies, businesses, any organization needs to understand the role that they play in national security. And I think those of us who kind of come from the DC bubble, we kind of take it for granted that everyone understands the interaction between the economy and national security and the private sector and public sector. But when you step outside of the Beltway and you start to interact with companies, I think it takes what I found in my experience is that it's those organizations that have more mature cybersecurity programs, that have a dedicated CISO that's kind of been in the industry for a while. Those are the ones who kind of have I really think, to be fair, the luxury, because they have resources to do the work, to be able to take a step back and say, oh, and I understand how my decisions are impacting national security. And I may be a Fortune 500, and so I operate at a scale where it does it. But I think this goes back to a comment that I made earlier about marketing. That was in the context of these jobs. But I think like the NCSC out of DNI does such a great job, and they create such good work on this topic. But there's no force behind it to get it out. Like they should be on. I know Bill Evanina just recently left, but like whenever he was on 60 Minutes, I'm like, that's awesome. Like he's got to be doing that all the time, because it's such an important message. And going back to what Lauren was saying, I think the result will be sometimes you need to pay a little more to get the better security, or you need to pay more while you're developing your products to make it more secure, which may mean that the product may be a little bit more premium priced, but that's okay. Or maybe it needs to cut into the margins. And I know these are not topics we kind of talk about in typically in capitalistic markets, because it's all about profit margins and shareholder equity, which is fine. But I think we do have to have an honest conversation about protecting our economy and protecting our nation. Now has a digital vector to it, and it's no longer the government that really has control over that, because we're not China, right? This is all private sector decisions being made, developing all this technology that's introducing vulnerabilities that are being exploited. And so we need companies to step up and say, we're going to do the right thing, even if it's not traditionally been viewed as the prudent thing for business. Because I think if you take a step back and there's, I'm not a military person, but you talk to really smart generals, right? I don't think they'll tell you it actually is the right thing to do for the economy, because in 25 and 30, 40 years, if we don't stop what's happening, our nation state adversaries will have exfiltrated trillions of dollars worth of IP, and we will no longer be in the position that we're in. So I think this message that we get, because we're from DC, I think needs to be simplified and made a priority to impact how boards and the private sector makes decisions to do exactly what Lauren said, because I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, that's great point, Parham. And
I
I would say just.
I had one thought
ahead,
I
Max.
wanted to jump in there with as well. Just furthering what Parham had to say. I think also it's helpful to try and distinguish to these companies that some additional regulation in this area to try and simplify their life would not disrupt their basic acquisition model. I mean, they call it the ABCs: acquire, buy, and create. And that's in that order. If you can acquire some innovative company that's created the capability you're looking for, that's best. If you can't acquire the entire company, then buy the service from them. And if that's nothing left after that, then you can build it yourself. As long as we don't disrupt that cycle, then innovation in this country shouldn't go away entirely. But there's room for that to exist alongside salient regulation in the space. And I think that would sort of put some teeth into what Parham is talking about as well, in a way that Silicon Valley is going to be just as resonating with that as the Beltway bubble.
Well, let's hope so. I mean, go ahead, Lauren.
Sorry, just a quick point on that. Parham, to your point too, I was moderating a panel this morning on supply chain security with Michael Orlando on there from the NCSC. So, to your point, and one of it was a great conversation. And, but one of the things that I brought up, to your point, Max, on, the ABC thing, I had a conversation recently with someone who works in the M&A space. And I asked them, is security part of your valuation? So when a company is valued, for acquisition or maybe even for IPO, is security a part of that? Because they are part of that supply chain. And it's not. And I think it absolutely should be. And I don't know if legislation is the answer there, because I don't quite know all the different, laws or whatever that go into, that whole process. But something needs to be done to get that to be part of evaluation, because, say you're valued at, I don't know, $1 billion or whatever. And then once the company is purchased or goes, public, a week later, their entire IP is gone, or something has happened, that valuation is over, and you've lost so much money there. So I really think that it should be part of that whole process.
I think there should be a panel in and of itself. I think that, if you look at the incentives of a company like Zoom in this, during the pandemic, or you look at the incentives of a big thing now, Clubhouse, right? Their incentive is to get a product that has fit with the market and spin it up and scale it as fast as possible. And security is always going to be a second consideration for them, because essentially if they don't do the first part, they don't exist, right? So without a regulatory framework, I just don't see that the incentive system would ever make sense for them to do that, no matter how much we cajole them. And then we have to realize that there's a tension between, protecting your IP and having IP worth protecting. So we got to balance both those, right? So we can't squash the innovation while we're trying to protect it. So I think fascinating issue. And so just going into maybe a little more specific part of that, we're talking about supply chain issues here. I can't believe you're on another panel today, Lauren. This has been the only panel for you today. But
that's what I thought.
I'll let you go.
Very busy day.
Yeah, exactly. Well, at least you didn't put on a coat for one thing, right?
Exactly.
I put this shirt on just for one thing. So Max, turning to you. So we all know SolarWinds, right? It's a huge issue that's driving a lot of what's happening now. So how do you see it's going to happen again? I've had my data hacked from OPM, from different health systems. They must know me if I ever show up in China very well. And so how can federal agencies and their Homeland Security partners really position themselves to respond to things? So you talked a little bit about this response and recovery, but maybe you kind of detail that a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's something to that. I think some investigation as to whether or not additional legal authority would be required to serve that sort of function, and then what form it would take would be, worthwhile uses of time and resources to try and understand that. I also think that additional involvement from the private sector would be helpful to properly advise the government around how they could actually shrink some of the scope of the federal networks. It's great that our agencies have a level of autonomy, but it does open up these vulnerability endpoints on their threat fabric when, EPA does it totally different than FEMA, who does it totally different than Treasury, who does it totally different than, DOJ. It's like if we could start to find some ways to consolidate those networks That would eliminate some of the threat points. And then if you want to be focused on things like defense, at least you know what you're defending and it's not such a patchwork and moving target. So that would help a ton. And then also the way that we communicate around some of these breaches is very, very difficult. And so without trying to figure out new sort of communication mechanisms to educate decision makers properly so that they can make good decisions, it's going to be an uphill battle. I mean, it should not be a condition of office to be an electrical engineer or a software developer of some sort. There's got to be mechanisms to message to these people in ways that are understandable without, delaying the system inevitably.
Great. Parham, how are your members dealing with this?
We've talked about supply chain and some of these issues already. We're a collaborative, and so that our members join to share best practices and lessons learned in this kind of safe space. And I'll be candid. And one of the things when this started happening was we saw the community kind of mobilize and activate and say, okay, this is happening. We need to come together and just talk about how we're dealing with this. And so we have right now, I think, 3 different task forces that we're kind of inspired from this, right? One focused on asset management, and so we're building a framework with that consists of how organizations have set up their asset management programs and how they're leveraging best of breed technologies and capabilities. We have one on supply chain, focused specifically on organizations who have software factories and are writing code, and how can they ensure that the code, the policies they have in place to ensure software integrity are working and learning from each other. And so I think for us, it's we've talked a lot about what would benefit industry, but one of the things that it is what we do, and it's kind of what I've done my whole career, and I enjoy seeing the results of, is when passionate individuals come together, they can really accomplish and move the needle forward. And I think that's kind of in this is such a big topic of national security and how do you combat Russia and China, right? And how do you start to do things? Sometimes it is just and this is not a plug for my organization. Do it wherever you can, but finding trusted organizations or trusted individuals and just compare notes and say, here's my challenge, here's what I'm trying to accomplish. How do you do it? Like I have limited resources. I only have a staff of 2. I have this much budget. If I'm trying to defend, somebody asked a question the other day of I'm trying to build my ransomware strategy, and I'm thinking of defending, investing in air gap.
That's a defensive strategy, right?
Yeah, it was a defense. Should I invest in air gap defense or this? And people responded, we're like, no, don't do that, do this. And I guarantee you, our member moved budget because of the responses they got, which were overwhelming, pointing them in one direction. That's how we can, as a community, come together, I think, and address some of these things. So that's that's what we're seeing.
So here's a question maybe you don't want to answer. Is there a SolarWinds happening right now that we don't know about? Is that just something we're going to have to accept, that there's something of this level happening almost all the time?
I mean, I hate to, I'm not privy to any kind of knowledge. Right. I would say, unfortunately, there is, and I'm not a doom and gloom type person. I think the reality is we're under constant, attack. We have to assume that all these vulnerabilities that are out there are being exploited right now. I don't believe that Russia, these particularly nation state actors who are very well resourced and very methodical have multiple strategies being deployed at any given time. Just because we heard about one doesn't mean we don't know about the others. And we're still uncovering the impact of SolarWinds. So unfortunately, I think the answer is yes, and we may hear of the next one, soon. It's a matter of, people keep, we're all going to roll our eyes, but people talk about like the cyber 911. It's like, that phrase sucks, but what more will it take? We talked about OPM, the Sony hack, Anthem. Now it's SolarWinds. Like, what needs to happen next to get people to change and act more rapidly, more quickly? I think that's the ultimate question, because I think these things will keep happening.
Yeah, excellent. So Lauren, perspective from you on SolarWinds, and you were doing some stuff on supply chain, so.
Yeah, well, to answer your question that you just asked, I think that, Parham's right, like, and the, there's a comment in the chat, there are unknown unknowns, and I think we would be kidding ourselves.
Donald Rumsfeld lives.
I know. I think we'd be kidding ourselves if we thought, oh, okay, that was a big one, but you know, we're okay now. Like, I don't think that is the case at all. But you know, I do not have any visibility into, you know, those threats, obviously. But yeah, I mean, and to the point on, you know, Cyber 9/11, I don't really like that term. I think it's more of a, we're sort of frogs and the water is boiling kind of situation. You know, a lot of bad things have happened. You know, our critical infrastructure is, you know, it's been mapped, it's being mapped, you know, and, you know, there's a term that my predecessor, Michael Solmeyer, who's now on the NSC, he and his colleague, Ben Buchanan, wrote an article back in 2016 where they use the term holding targets at risk. And, you know, I think when there's a lot of discourse about like, you know, oh, is it cyber espionage? Is it cyber attack? Is it an act of war? You know, I think we lose some of that nuance there, you know, because a lot of people are like, oh, well, this is a cyber attack. That means it's cyber war, right? And we're like, okay, well, you know, no, but we don't know like the full extent of the operation and its intent and all that. You know, and a lot, you know, we all say, okay, well, it was cyber espionage, but I think there's still like a little bit of nuance there. I think, you know, potentially, again, it's more than just like stealing information. It's the ability to hold certain targets at risk. And that I think is a really important distinction because, you know, again, like I said, it's not just like stealing information. And so I think that's something that we really need to be very cognizant of as we sort of move forward and assess our risk there.
Excellent. That's a great term. Hold certain targets at risk.
Yeah.
So I am going to hold us to our time, and I really appreciate all of you. It's fascinating. Definitely some topics to follow up on. I think this regulatory thing is huge. It's going to happen. I think we're all recognizing that, and I think some of the talk we had here about intergovernmental and how do we work across these sectors is going to be crucial. So I appreciate all of your time, and we will be sending out a copy of the video for anyone who would like it, or it'll be on our website at corneralliance.com. And with that, Max, Lauren, Parham, thank you so much. You guys were awesome. Enjoy your day.
Thanks so much, Alan.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Have a good one.